In many parts of the Midwest, an ongoing drought has forced ranchers to cull their herds and sell cattle prematurely as the grass fails to grow and forage crops become scarce. Water sources also run low and dry up, requiring extra time and expense to haul it to pastures. Farmers, too, face additional challenges with changing weather patterns, planting their crops in soil lacking sufficient moisture to help the seeds they plant germinate and grow, and too often watching helplessly as their crops slowly wither in the fields, with kernels of grain in the seed heads shriveling in the heat, reducing yields and farm income.
Hi, I'm Dave Kendall of Prairie Hollow Productions, a fifth-generation Kansan whose family started farming here in the 1850s. While drought remains a serious problem for today's food producers, they also must contend with intense thunderstorms that can wash away valuable topsoil as rain runs quickly off fields instead of soaking in. And it's not just farmers and ranchers with their crops and livestock being adversely impacted by atmospheric conditions. Those living in cities and towns also have to deal with more severe weather on this warming planet. My friend Rex Buchanan, former director of the Kansas Geological Survey, and my wife, Laura Mead, joined me to speak with a number of different people who've shared their unique perspectives on the situation we're in. Come along with us on this journey as we explore the impact of climate change on our part of the Great Plains, looking at what's being done to help deal with the challenges posed by increasing temperatures and extreme weather events. We're facing some hot times in the Heartland. You might want to sit up and take note as we hear from some of the folks most tuned in to what's happening.
Welcome to the News Hour. New findings out tonight show the main cause of the climate crisis is rapidly getting worse. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere hit record levels in the spring, the highest in more than 4 million years.
The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration also reports the buildup of the heat-trapping gas is accelerating.
Does NOAA have an official position on climate change?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it matches what the National Climate Assessment says. And the National Climate Assessment, very, very quickly, is something that Congress mandated that we do every 4 or 5 years. And so since about 1990, maybe a little after that, we've put out reports, we being all the federal agencies, academics, and private industry have worked together to put these out. We're in the midst of one now. And that is sort of accumulated information on how our climate has changed and is changing, and looking to future impacts as well as current impacts of what's going on. One of the things we see is the number of record high temperatures that we're hitting far outpaces record low temperatures. There's a definite trend. There's lots of proxy, if you call it proxy data, that really tells us these things. Glaciers melting, in certain areas a lot and actually fading away over time. Oceans warming, acidity levels in the ocean increasing, sea level rise, things like that.
People in the Midwest probably sort of look at that and go, well, that's not my problem. But flooding events are.
Right.
And so that manifestation, while maybe not as inexorable or clear, is certainly considerable, right?
Well, let's take Katrina, for example, in 2005. It was pretty devastating to New Orleans. And what was it, a few years after that? Harvey in Houston. I happen to know people that have moved from a coastal area to this area for lots of reasons, right? But part of it was they were displaced by sea level rise combined with a major storm like a hurricane or something like that, and they didn't have a place to live. So there is what we call climate migration, and that's going on around the world as well. Places getting too wet, too dry, too hot. That's happening around the world. It's a semi-political issue too, obviously, but that's a manifestation of climate change, for sure. But my job is more to inform adaptation and resilience methodology. In other words, saying, well, it's going to be 10 degrees warmer in 100 years. So what are you going to do about it? Or what can we do about it? Because it's already built in. The mitigation thing, we need to get to mitigation. Mitigation meaning we need to get all this carbon dioxide out of the air, okay, one way or the other. But we've built in 100 to 1,000 years of warming already. So even if we had zero man-made, if you will, gases, we're still going to see rising temperatures for a while. That's built in because the oceans are like a bank, if you will. What we're talking about now, more than mitigation, is adaptation. So what are we going to do about it? We're going to build bigger air conditioners, or what? You know, do we need to build more places for people to go to stay out of the heat? When we have these record high temperatures, we've always had record highs sometimes during the year. When you experience those now, you're probably getting a taste of what your kids and grandkids are going to be feeling much more often than we are right now. Okay, so that's one way to think about personal impact. Now, it's not all about us. It's about us and future generations too.
How much time do you spend dealing with people who deny that climate change has even taken place? Or if it has, that it's anthropogenic?
So it's a great question. And there's a couple different angles on this. One is, if I get on an airplane and fly somewhere, I'll sit next to somebody, I'll tell them what I do, and they'll ask me, hey, do you believe in climate change? I get that question a lot. Do you believe in climate change? The key word there is believe, right? And my answer to that is, well, you know, to me, it's not, for me, it's not a belief system. I understand the science behind climate. I know what's happening around the world. I can look at the temperatures, I can look at the precipitation, and yeah, it's not a belief though, it's what the science tells me is happening.
The new report from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, found that within a decade, the world is likely to miss its goal of holding global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. If or when the planet reaches that level, scientists say Earth will pass tipping points that will lead to catastrophic environmental damage, including dangerous sea level rise, entire species going extinct, and even greater suffering in many nations, especially the poorest. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the time to act is now.
Humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast.
Ice really is melting all around the Earth. A professor of geology at the University of Kansas, Lee Stearns has been studying the dynamics of glaciers and ice sheets in a number of different places, including Antarctica and Greenland. We spoke with her remotely during a period in which she was away from campus.
One of the things I would like to start with is maybe help people understand why Greenland is so important. How come you hear so much about Greenland when it comes to this whole issue?
My first trip to Greenland was in 2005 as a PhD student, and I'd been studying actually this glacier in the back, Helheim Glacier in East Greenland, for my dissertation, and had been looking at imagery of where the terminus was and how it looked for the preceding 15 years, for however long we had good satellite imagery. And then when we got there, it had retreated 4 miles from the place where it had been stable for the previous 20 years. And that was a really new discovery then, that it could change in a year that quickly. And we also know by looking at other geologic evidence that it has not retreated this far back in at least thousands of years. So it is definitely out of the ordinary what we're seeing now in Greenland. So that's why Greenland has been getting a lot of press.
I guess I also assume just sheer size in this process in terms of Greenland. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, Antarctica holds more ice in it. If all of Antarctica melts, it's 32 meters of sea level rise. If all of Greenland melts, it's 7 meters of sea level rise. So it is the smaller ice sheet, but it's the one that's much more susceptible to melt. I mean, it's a huge ice sheet, changing more quickly than Antarctica is. And nobody's saying that the whole thing is going to melt anytime soon. But as we know, very small changes have very large societal impacts. And so, even if it's an increase in a millimeter from one area, that has kind of large scale effects, even for Kansas. We're not worried about flooding from sea level rise, but in terms of ocean circulation, driving some of our weather patterns, in terms of sea level rise impacting the US ports and economy and globally, I think 80% of goods around the world are moved by ship. And so we need ports that are stable and not susceptible to flooding at an increased rate. And so Greenland might feel very far removed, but it's very closely connected to a lot of systems that we depend on.
Yeah, and you know this probably better than I do, but in geology, you get that climate change is nothing new conversation. You hear that all the time. Mm-hmm. But what I think is new is that rate of change thing, right?
Yes, I mean, I don't have the number in front of me, but it's something like, throughout geologic time, it would take 500 or 1,000 years to warm, during the warming cycles, it would take 1,000 years to warm a degree. And now we can do that in 50 years. And again, when I started 20 years ago, we really thought that glaciers responded slowly to a changing climate, that they would slowly kind of get thinner and retreat. And it's been pretty new science to observe them changing very quickly, really calving off large chunks at a time, thinning 100 meters in a year in some glaciers. Those were not expected. And so a lot of the focus in trying to understand kind of current rates of sea level rise and how the ice sheets are contributing to that and how that's going to change, in the next 50 to 100 years, really rely on how quickly Greenland and Antarctica are responding to a warming climate. So while sea level rise seems far away, since we're in the middle of the country, shifts in weather are also shifts in weather that impact the ice sheets and are impacted by a change in Arctic regions. And so that's linked to the weather that we see here. In particular, sea ice concentration is the biggest change that we're seeing in the Arctic right now. Bright white sea ice reflects a lot of incoming solar radiation. We've seen a huge decrease in the aerial extent of sea ice, let alone the thickness of the sea ice, which is another thing. That formation and melt of sea ice drives a lot of our ocean circulation, which is very important, but also drives a lot of our weather patterns that will impact Kansas.
But at the end of the day, anthropogenic climate change is still sort of the underlying driver, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Greenland would probably not be very stable in the climate that, even with reduced anthropogenic warming, but it would be a very slow change. It would lose mass, very, very slowly. We are making these changes happen very quickly and in ways that in geologic time we have not seen before. So we can't look back, 10,000 years ago and say, oh, well, the last time they had a major shift, they did it this way. We can't look back that far because the rate of change for both the ocean and the atmosphere is much faster than we've seen before. And so when I started, Greenland in particular was kind of in balance with its current climate. It was losing mass, but not quite as quickly as today. And that has really shifted in the past 20 years. It's really been accelerating its mass loss in ways that we understand it, and then in ways that are a little bit surprising year to year in terms of what glaciers are accelerating and by how much and why. And so Greenland has reached a lot of headlines lately because of a lot of dramatic changes that have taken place.
On a bluff above the Smoky Hill River near Salina, Kansas, staff at the Land Institute carry on with research initiated by its co-founder and president emeritus, Wes Jackson, who recently co-authored a book reflecting on what he calls the multiple cascading crises of climate change.
How concerned do you think folks here are about climate change?
Not enough. A lot of it has to do with, well, what can I do? What can we do? And they don't feel empowered. And that's not a dumb point of view. you know, we all feel not very empowered.
And there are limits to what an individual can do in this process. I mean, you
Yeah.
might reduce your carbon footprint, but as an individual, that doesn't make a huge amount of difference on CO2 levels worldwide.
Yeah. You know, one way I think about this is, you know, for 10,000 years, we've been going up, up, up. 10,000 years since the beginning of agriculture, in which we've been doing all this. Here we are right here on the end of the thumb, and that's the fossil fuel period. That's where the biggest chunk came, was when we got into the coal, the oil, the gas. All right, so now we're going to have to start going this way, and we have no precedent for how to think about that. And what we're trying to say in this book is that there have always been prophets, prophets that would tell what's coming.
So without further ado, I'm happy to give you Bill McKibben.
The climate activist, who's published several prophetic books, spoke at the Land Institute's Prairie Festival in 2019.
What I'm trying to say is something you already know, that climate change is by far the biggest thing that human beings have ever done on this planet. I mean, by orders of magnitude larger than anything we've ever done. And that we're still relatively near the start of this story. We've raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree so far, Celsius, but we're on a path, even if we kept the promises, everybody kept the promises that they made at Paris, to raise the temperature of the planet more than 3 degrees Celsius, going on 6-7 degrees Fahrenheit. If we do that, the increase in damage from what I've already described is not going to be linear, it's going to be exponential, because we keep going past tipping points that trigger new feedback loops that make things very, very difficult.
This is one of the reasons that Bob Jensen and I did this book. I mean, we wrote this book hoping that people would take it sufficiently seriously that would increase the probability of a soft landing. Then we can engage in this downpower. You know, we invent things that we didn't evolve with. But we say that's the advancement of civilization. Well, it's the advancement of civilization, and what's sort of fascinating to me is that right now we are living right at a point in which there's going to be a flattening and then a decline. And in that decline, there will be a few that will begin to think, how are we going to live on a downpower? So if we cannot figure out a way to gracefully make that transition, then nature will take care of it for us.
Our job somehow is to arrest things as close to 1 degree and as far from 3 degrees as we can. And that's an enormous job. It may be an impossible one, but it's definitely the one to which we are called at the moment.
We need to understand in much more tangible, specific, poetic, lyrical kinds of terms what we're losing, what we stand to lose, and what we could gain with pretty common sense, practical actions.
Nancy Jackson, who for a time was married to Wes Jackson's son, says she didn't know much about climate change at the time she read a review of books on the subject written by Bill McKibben. Motivated to do something about it, she quit the job she had and proceeded to play a key role in the creation of an initiative at the Land Institute called the Climate and Energy Project, which really started cranking up in 2008.
So when all of this started, when we started Climate and Energy Project, global warming was the term. Climate change kind of moved into dominance over time. Early in my time at Climate and Energy, I had the great good fortune to have a conversation with Hunter Levins. And Hunter at the time was saying, we have got our terminology all wrong on this, and we need to be talking about climate chaos, because that is in fact what is going to happen, and it's a lot scarier. global warming sounds kind of benign, really, and climate change, whatever, change could be good or bad. And I do think that I think it's happening, but I think we need to get better at talking about what this really means, which is a lot of horribly unexpected weather at all the wrong times, storms that are stalled forever. We're seeing it happen. So being able to talk about this phenomenon in different ways that help people to imagine the kind of displacement and destruction that is going to be a commonplace it's a big deal.
So how many years were you at the Climate and Energy Project?
I was only leading the Climate and Energy Project for 4 years, and then I was chair of the board for a couple years after that. But I was really only there for 4 years, and it was a tiny group of us, 5 people, who were ardently, determined to make a difference, not just in the state, but to be able to have Kansas lead the nation in a way that was important. And what we were convinced about was that climate action was taking place on the coasts, right? Lots of things were happening in the upper Midwest as well. It was not happening in the red heart of America. And what we believed, and what I still believe, is that demonstrating that people can take meaningful action regardless of their political beliefs was critically important to giving everybody the sense that this was a problem that could be solved.
In addition to her involvement with the Climate and Energy Project, which has grown into a self-supporting nonprofit organization promoting clean energy and climate resilience, Nancy Jackson has also served on the board of Climate Action Kansas City, another local organization focusing on issues related to climate change.
Climate is one of these gigantic problems that feels very difficult for individuals to solve. And so much of the debate has been at the national and even international level, which leaves kind of regular people out of it. And my absolute conviction is that this is a contest that ultimately will be won on the ground, right? Community by community by community, that towns will make decisions about reducing their carbon output long before the nation will be able to get to any kind of a viable agreement. So what Climate Action Kansas City is about is a coalition of over 100 elected leaders in Kansas and Missouri, big and small towns, right? The mayor of Kansas City, but also of, Merriam, tiny. So, and it's really looking at what are all the things that cities themselves can do to reduce carbon emissions. And that, I believe, is where we're going to win the game.
Whatever is to come to pass in America must first come to pass in the heart of America.
There you go.
Lindsay Constance, a middle school educator who had been serving on the city council in Shawnee, Kansas, and Mike Kelly, an attorney who was then mayor of Roland Park, Kansas, were honored with a Regional Leadership Award in 2021 for their role in launching Climate Action Kansas City.
So it all started, we met a woman who was doing presentations on Paul Hawken's book, Drawdown. And when Mike and I looked at that book, we just found it so hopeful that it laid out the solutions that had already been determined that would help us reverse global warming. So we decided to do a presentation for elected officials. We got space at a church in Prairie Village. We started calling everyone we knew, and then they called everyone they knew. And before we knew it, we had 135 people at a church in Prairie Village, and we had some women present about Drawdown and share about those solutions. And then it was just an opportunity for nonprofit leaders and scientists and elected officials to sit and plan and brainstorm. And that was really what started Climate Action KC, was that Saturday afternoon at a church in Prairie Village. And then after that, Mike and I felt so great about the event, and then people were asking us, well, what's next? What are we doing now? And we were a little bit dumbfounded, because our idea was to have people come together and learn about these solutions, but we really hadn't thought past that. And so Mike and I and several other leaders came and actually met on this couch in my living room after that event to figure out what to do next. And so that's when we formed the organization, now known as Climate Action KC, and we decided our first order of business was to create that climate playbook. Solutions that we could give to elected officials, that we could give to city council people, of ideas that they could do right away. And they didn't need the federal government's permission or the state's permission. They could just enact these policies now. And so we started working on that. And then we planned our first climate summit, and it literally started right here.
The work done in Kansas City has been valid, bold, and commendable, but due to the daunting challenges we face, it is by no means sufficient. And that is why we are all here together today. America's carbon dioxide emissions rose by 3.4% in 2018, which is the biggest increase in 8 years.
So we find ourselves at this crossroads. We are met with tremendous opportunities, and we know that solutions exist, but we are met facing the reality of a rapidly accelerating challenge. However, we believe that change can and must spring from this metropolitan area.
It was amazing. It was in 2019. We actually had Paul Hawken speak. He was our keynote speaker, so he talked about drawdown, and it was so exciting because that linked right to our local playbook, and we had nearly 700 people attend. It was positive, it was energetic. And then from there, we embarked on that regional climate action plan that we did with Mid-America Regional Council. So that was kind of the starting point of that piece.
As we're becoming more aware of the local impact of climate change and beginning to do something about it, younger generations feel an even greater urgency to respond.
The global climate crisis is changing Kansas as we know it and upending my generation's assumptions about a future in our home state.
A few years ago, as he was finishing high school in Lawrence, Evan McHenry wrote an article published in Lawrence Magazine.
As things are shaping up, my generation will be growing into a transformed Kansas, a state scarred by natural disasters, submerged by floods, and shaken by environmental instability. It is deeply distressing that though the effects of climate change are already happening, alarming numbers of adults refuse to acknowledge the problem. Perhaps the issue still seems theoretical to them. Perhaps they believe the expertise and consensus of scientists around the world are up for debate. But for Kansans my age, the climate crisis is an impending reality. Most people my generation tend to accept climate change as like a fact, and I don't really encounter that in people 20, 30 years older than me who, some of them just don't believe in it or just like haven't grown up, with it kind of understood as a fact. I mean, people my generation, some of them probably disagree about what to do about it, and maybe some of them don't believe in it, but it's just something that you kind of accept as like true, and that may be something, a product of like the social spheres that I'm in. But also, I just think generally, like, yeah, the skepticism extends more heavily in the older generations. The science is settled and the warnings are clear. Older generations will see the first effects of this crisis, and my generation will suffer through it. We are in immediate danger and there is a narrowing window for action. As each day passes, the possibilities for a sustainable future diminish. Those of us whose future is being determined before we have the political or financial clout to determine it for ourselves feel the clock ticking. The problem isn't completely unfixable, but we have to act. I wish I could say the outlook is hopeful, but it isn't, and for my generation, it's hard to be optimistic.
For many, the realities of climate change can be overwhelming, and in some cases, it can lead to extreme depression and even suicide. Such was the case with a young man from Kansas City, whose mother found a productive way to channel her grief.
I used to say I'm a grieving mother, and I don't say that anymore. I'm a mother. I'm a naturalist. I so connect with the natural world. In 2002, my older son was an environmental activist and was working on his master's degree in urban and regional planning. He was in a joint law program. Had undergraduate studies in environmental studies and sociology, and the more he learned about climate change and how much human destruction there was around the planet, the more he understood about all of the social justice impacts of human-caused climate change, the less he felt he was going to make any difference. And we lost him in 2003 to suicide. And he journaled a lot, and one of the statements in his journals was, I know all about sustainability, but I don't know how to sustain myself.
A software developer by profession, Sammy Aaron says that she started taking yoga classes immediately after her son's funeral as she began to cope with his loss, eventually becoming a yoga teacher herself.
Long story short, I started teaching pranayama, which was the yoga breathing practice, got into meditation. I wasn't all that interested in teaching the asana, the physical yoga poses, but it was the deeper practices that really called to me. And I started leading workshops, Heal Your Grieving Heart workshops, really focusing on the emotional and spiritual perspective and not so much the physiological perspective. So, yeah.
So then what gave you the idea to create the Resilient Activist? And I guess I should ask, what is the Resilient Activist? How did that come about?
One of the things that there was this time, I was heading towards the age of 65, thinking about closing down my software business. There was in the back of my mind the words, the Resilient Activist. Because what I knew was the world needed people just like my son, needed people who had the science, the education, the heart, the enthusiasm, the compassion, the sensitivity to really make the shift that the world needs to make, right, in order to alleviate so much suffering that's happening now and that's going to be happening. And those people need emotional support. Those people need to know how to sustain themselves, right? And our mission really is to help support people as we navigate climate change. Our main focus is on supporting environmental activists. They're kind of a unique subset of people who have climate anxiety and all the mental health conditions that are now just really recently being identified as the emotional impact of climate change. And so we incorporated in March of 2018 and just kind of wound our way into where we are now.
In addition to providing online activities like climate cafes and book discussions, the Resilient Activist offers workshops that provide resources for dealing with climate change, aimed specifically at those who work in fields most impacted by it.
But it's this long-term practice of finding the way to live with the grief, the fear and knowing of it's only going to get worse, and the recognition that there's still so much beauty out there. How do you even notice that the sumac here is so gorgeous? How are you drawn to that when all you could think about is your grief? Because then you're closed off, right? How do we do that? And that's a big part of it, because the more joy we have as activists, the more we can give, the better we feel, the better we think, right? If we're in fight or flight mode all the time, we don't even have all of our brain capacity because everything's immediate. And there's no immediate solution to any of this, right? And so that's what we offer.
As a nonprofit organization, the Resilient Activist hosts occasional fundraisers to help support its activities. These also provide an opportunity for like-minded individuals to come together and share a sense of community.
Every single thing, every single one of us does is of great value if it's done from the heart and with joy. And then if it's shared. That's a hard one, right? We have to talk climate change. We have to talk about how we feel. We have to be open to being vulnerable and having that letter, that template letter of I need to say this, I need to speak my truth about this. Because community is going to gather around that, right? That's it.
If you or someone you know is having suicidal thoughts, help is available through the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by simply calling or texting 988.
Sunlight to all of those relatives, all of that life, those gifts that we're surrounded with.
Dan Wildcat, a Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma and longtime faculty member at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, led the ceremony welcoming everyone to a special gathering on the Haskell campus in early June of 2022. This was the first in a series of public conversations initiated by Lawrence resident Steve Lerner through a project called Step by Step, inviting people to share their concerns related to climate change.
And I'm a psychologist in my day job as well as a filmmaker. And as a psychologist, and I know there's several other folks here that do therapy work like I do, as a psychologist, I've known for quite a long time, and it's clear in the research, that some 70+% of Americans are very worried about the climate, and very, very few people actually talk about it. Climate anxiety is becoming a very well-known topic among psychologists and psychiatrists. In fact, the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association have climate anxiety divisions, or groups that are specifically focused on studying it. Those who are researching it report an increase in anxiety-related disorders and other kinds of symptom pictures. And it doesn't mean that a person walking in to see a therapist immediately says, I'm here because I'm frightened about climate change. But if you think about climate change as a background anxiety that's affecting our culture, and maybe different segments of the culture, of the population, may be affected more extremely. I think it's a background force that's driving a lot of reactivity. I mean, the psychologist in me says some of the divisiveness in our culture may be being driven by a different anxiety than the topic of the debates. I mean, as a species, we're facing severe impingements from climate change on everything about the way we live. And how does that affect people? They may not think, well, I'm scared because of climate change. They just may act more reactive than usual because anxiety is boosting up.
With funding from Humanities Kansas, Lerner convened half a dozen gatherings around the state, inviting participants to break into small groups to converse with each other after listening to his own remarks, along with a bit of indigenous wisdom, or indigenuity as Dan Wildcat calls it.
Well, I read Dan's book, Red Alert, and that's when it occurred to me that that would be a great starting point for each one of these events, because it gets people thinking differently about where we fit in.
In my book, Red Alert, I made the argument that I'm all for climate change, a cultural climate change, because we cannot address the physical climate change we are seeing on the planet if we keep thinking the way we've thought. We need a cultural climate change.
I mean, one of the things that surprised me in starting Step by Step Kansas is that people seem unusually willing to talk about it now in a way that 5 years ago I don't think they would have been.
We talk a lot in our places like Haskell we talk about 7 generations. We talk about thinking about our responsibilities for 7 generations into the future. I'm asking you to think about something really radical, and that is broaden your notion of persons to include different than human persons on the planet, who, by the way, have a lot to teach us. They have lessons to teach us about how we can be more competent, mature human beings. Again, that's not romanticism. I call that indigenous realism.
And so it gets at the notion of coming together for a very challenging, large cause. We can't make a change if we don't have people coming together to talk about it.
The step-by-step gathering in Topeka took place in a hall connected to Grace Cathedral, where the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Kansas has their office. The Right Reverend Kathleen Chittenden Bascom became the first female to assume that role, being formally consecrated by the Most Reverend Michael Curry, presiding Bishop of the Episcopal Church, in March of 2019.
Be a faithful steward of God's holy word and sacrament. Now, Kansas, stand up and greet your new bishop and her family.
Our diocese, and that's the geographic region, is the eastern 40% of Kansas. There are 44 churches in the diocese, and the clergy are my flock in a way, and the parishes are my flock. And I interpret that responsibility isn't just to those churches.
Bishop Bascom considers each parish to be inclusive of the surrounding natural environment in which it exists, and she believes it's necessary to engage with issues that may sometimes be politically polarizing. Before she was elected bishop, she was appointed to a national task force on creation care developed by the Episcopal Church.
Earth stewardship, another way to talk about it, and care of creation, I think is actually less polarized than many things. That people of both and all political parties, many are engaged.
She has also been personally engaged with the international climate conferences organized through the United Nations.
The Episcopal Church had a delegation virtually to the Council of Parties, both COP26 and COP27. And out of that, a number of us who live in the Midwest region, we call ourselves the Great Middle. So we've been meeting virtually to just get people to come online and to hear more about the realities of climate change and the effects and the climate disasters and the changes. Just inviting people into conversation and trying to learn how to not hit hot buttons, but to say we respect one another. So to try to have that conversation, knowing how precious the earth is, and that this is what we call in religious terms a kairos moment, which means a holy and a time to get after it, that we are called in this moment to work on it.
In addition to encouraging such conversations, the bishop has developed a Creation Trustees Network.
It really grew out of a story of going to Blue Rapids and Marysville, where we have churches, and having time with one of our older members there, who I learned was from a church called St. Hilda's. And he pointed toward Tuttle Reservoir, and he said, well, St. Hilda's is there in the bottom. It was one of those towns that was taken. And that just really moved me. I was like, wow, St. Hilda's is at the bottom. And he was very concerned about Tuttle Reservoir silting in and what that's going to mean for all these communities in the Kansas River watershed. But so that kind of set me. So he is one of my creation stewards, somebody who, has land up in that region, was talking to me about things he was doing. If we can build this network of Episcopalians devoted to keeping their rangeland and not developing it, that's the kind of thing we're doing.
With a special affinity for tallgrass prairie, the bishop has demonstrated her understanding and appreciation of the important environmental role it plays with the publication of a novel based upon prior experiences in Iowa.
So when I was in Iowa, the 2008 flood occurred, and in downtown Des Moines, I was dean of the cathedral there, and I came to learn that, part of the reason that Iowa was suffering so much from flooding, it was climate change and what was going on in the atmosphere, but also that Iowa has only 1/1000th of its original tallgrass prairie left. So with losing all of that biomass under the earth. The rivers were flooding, and I could see in Des Moines that really see the suffering of people of least economic means. And often people, people of color are the ones who suffer most in those climate events, and was able to see that firsthand, and it came together with this understanding that, wow, it's all interwoven. So that's Of Green Stuff Woven is the title. It comes from Walt Whitman, his famous Leaves of Grass, and that idea that humanity, what happens to whatever our environment is, the earth, the grasslands, happens to humanity.
In the aftermath of the flooding in Iowa, she says the decision was made to recreate a small prairie in downtown Des Moines to teach people about the role it plays in maintaining water quality and mitigating the impact of floods. When she assumed her new position in Kansas, she brought a version of that idea with her.
We've been trying to develop our land as well, right? So our 3 acres here, the diocese since 1860 has had a parcel of land here, and it used to be 20 acres, and now Grace Cathedral's on it, Topeka High School is on the land, and we are trying to be important stewards and just put in this urban green space with a teaching prairie, culinary garden, spiritual life garden, an outdoor chapel dedicated to the Episcopal African American Church that was closed in 1964. So remembering St. Simon's. But we are kind of the center of these other church properties. So we have 18 around the diocese that are on church lands, and trying to have church lands also, what can we do for biodiversity, for, water use? And what's been kind of cool is that sometimes it's the churches who are littler, fewer people, who've kind of, not been seen as the big heroes in much of the 20th century as these large urban churches are growing and lots of wealth. They suddenly see the riches they have environmentally, and are kind of some of our new heroes. They're putting in postage stamp prairies. They're able to do it, they're helping to clean various lakes, by what they're putting along the waterfront. Anyway, I think that's a wonderful story about kind of the last shall be first, and it's fun to see it.
John Blair isn't the only one who thinks our failure to effectively address the challenges we face reflects a lack of political will. A number of groups and organizations are trying to do something about that, including one that brings people of different faiths together to lobby the Kansas legislature.
The organization initially started off as a single-issue climate change organization called Kansas Interfaith Power and Light. It's part of a national network of organizations. In 2016, we became Kansas Interfaith Action, with climate being one of our issue areas.
Rabbi Modi Reber serves as the executive director of Kansas Interfaith Action, also referred to as KIFA.
So we're a statewide organization that works on issue advocacy on the state level. So I am a registered lobbyist. We have affiliations with most of the major denominations in the state, most of the major mainline denominations in the state. So we bring the faith voice to conversations about public policy in areas like Medicaid expansion, poverty issues, hunger issues, clean energy. So anything that comes up that's in those issue areas we'll get involved with. That could mean meeting with legislators, testifying, doing action alerts, doing demonstrations sometimes, depending on the situation, but always trying to get our voice heard so that people realize that there's a strong faith voice for justice. We say climate is a justice issue, primarily because the people who are hurt first and worst by climate disruption are poor people and people of color. And that's both in this country and abroad. But the people who have the least capacity for dealing with the problem and who have the least responsibility for causing the problem often get the worst repercussions of it, and they also have the least resources for dealing with the problem.
When addressing the diverse problems confronting the world today, the rabbi references a concept that's become more widely used in recent years.
Tikkun olam is the Jewish concept of repairing the world. That we, as human beings, have a unique responsibility to helping put God's will into work in the world. That the world is broken in important ways, including the way we power our society, pollution and climate disruption. And one of the ways we do godly work is by addressing those issues, both healing the damage, but also making sure that people don't suffer due to the damage.
We've been talking about the danger of the Keystone Pipeline since 2011, 2012. That's right. And there's been, I think it's 20
During one of its advocacy days at the state capitol, KIFA put the spotlight on a major rupture involving a pipeline passing through the state, which took place in December of 2022. Originating in Canada, the pipeline carries a diluted form of a substance called bitumen, an oil product derived from tar sands.
We were on record as opposing the Keystone Pipeline for a long time, and we were part of the coalition that led first Obama and then Biden to cancel the XL pipeline. But there's still a Keystone Pipeline that comes through central Kansas, and it burst, releasing hundreds of thousands of gallons of this bitumen in farmland in north central Kansas. It happened in a place where there's not a lot of press. People were kept out of the site, so they couldn't really see the site. They claim that everything's been cleaned up, but I know that they were very interested in keeping things kind of quiet. It speaks to a larger issue. The more we rely on extreme forms of energy, using these tar sands, piping these tar sands across the country, the more dangerous it is. The more likely it is that it's going to have a severe environmental cost.
So we are here today to call attention to this violence that's been done on the earth. And we've brought together activists and faith leaders to talk about this issue. The first thing
The thing about the Kansas legislature is that there's no place to have a conversation about environmental issues or climate issues. There's commodity committees like ag and natural resources, there's energy, but there isn't an environment committee. So every time something comes up that has an environmental, it usually goes through one of the commerce committees or the utilities committee, and they might not be thinking in terms that we would want them to think. We're past the point of having hearings about climate change. Like we used to have hearings about whether climate change was real or not, where there'd be a dog and pony show. They don't do that so much anymore. That conversation is different. And so instead of actually addressing the dangers, try to pretend they don't exist. And you still don't hear the word climate in the legislature at all, really. It's a difficult time.
Not a single bill
we have a fairly supportive governor. She certainly knows a lot about clean energy and supportive of clean energy. You know, in Kansas, we've done very well with the wind industry. We're one of the biggest producers of wind energy in the country. And that's largely due to policies that were put in place years ago that have led to that result.
When the power company known as Evergy delayed its plans to retire a coal-fired plant a few miles upstream from Bowersock Dam, the Kansas Sierra Club organized a protest rally at the intersection adjacent to City Hall in Lawrence.
Lawrence has been doing a really amazing climate action planning process, and from day one the idea was to center equity.
An associate professor and director of the Center for Compassionate and Sustainable Communities at the University of Kansas, Ward Lyles teaches courses on regional planning and climate change. He also serves on the steering committee for the Douglas County Climate Action Plan. He's observed some notable changes over the past decade since he first moved to Lawrence and is concerned about the impact of climate change on public health.
Just over the last 10 years here in Lawrence, I mean, we have more and more high pulse rain events and longer periods of drought. We're in one now. The river right behind us is really low right now. The average citizen may not feel that and see that in their daily life, but people's skin's drier right now because we haven't had rain in a while. I mean, and asthma, right, and allergies. So public health is a huge piece that I think we're only really beginning to talk seriously about now. Inequity is the biggest problem tied in with climate change, full stop. I mean, it's inequity because people who have resources can wall up, either by moving away or flying away when there's a power outage, these kind of things. People with less resources just have to buckle under.
A significant part of the challenge that professors such as Ward Lyles encounter revolves around the level of anxiety and depression their students are dealing with.
Students are coming to me in our classes in planning despondent. I mean, there's climate grief, climate anxiety. This is a huge and growing field to grapple with the mental health and physical consequences of stress. People in their teens and 20s are, again, they go to college if they come to KU. They take classes that expose them to environmental degradation, ways that our oil and gas systems pollute our waters and our air, ways that oil and gas is associated with violence against black and brown people around the world, ways that the rich get richer. I mean, there's so many things that they are taught about the way that our systems have flaws. But if you're a sociology student or a geology student, environmental studies student, rarely are you shown that you have any individual agency. And the problem is so big and daunting. It's collective. I spent 10 or 15 years falling into the trap that a lot of the fossil fuel industry set, which was to make everything about individual behavior. Oh, I need to drive less, I need to eat no more, I need to avoid meat, so on and so forth. We have to do this as a group. That is the only way, because it needs policy change, planning, transformation of our communities. What they experience when they hit a class that teaches them about cities and how community organizing and neighborhood associations and transportation choices all go together for climate change, they tend to be a little more energized.
And if you now begin to talk about more collective kind of solutions, how does that go down?
Well, it's really hard. We are not built as humans to care about 7 billion people. It's a bigger number than our brains can handle. Our brains aren't really good at numbers more than like 100, 200, right? And maybe even 20. It's just hard to conceptualize. It's that you have to make it human, relationship to relationship. So in my classes, yes, we talk about big numbers and things, but we do perspective taking exercises. The next exercise students in my graduate class on compassionate critical thinking is think of yourself and how climate change affects you in a daily life. And just think about it and write a paragraph. They read a little bit about an activist from Uganda or an activist from New York City who's roughly their age but may have a different identity, different race, different gender things, but somebody they can relate a little more closely to. Think through what that would be, and these exercises humanize climate change. They humanize, because that really, I don't care what your political or faith tradition is, there's a very small portion of our society that's genuinely sociopathic. Most of us do care and have empathy, but a lot of times we get messages that empathy is weak, or empathy is not sustainable, that empathy should only be given to some people. And we're not going to get anywhere unless we can do this by looking at different people than ourselves and saying, you matter.
So if you had to tell a story related to climate change, just like you've been talking about, what would that story be here?
The only way we're going to make it is if we look after each other and strengthen relationships of care and concern. So what I do in my classes, I spend a lot of time going slow to go fast. We get to know each other in our classes and our different experiences so that when it comes time to talk about the intersection of climate and racism and inequity, we can talk about it. I've had classes where partway through the semester, as we've gotten to know each other, we were talking about what might happen if we did a more systematic provision of shaded cool spaces for homeless people through summers. That led one student to share that this is a person who's Alaska Native, that they had a relative who froze to death, having no access to the things they needed to survive. The sense of vulnerability and care at the same time in that classroom was profound. Doesn't happen every day, but when we have those moments, we are finding resilience in our connections to each other.
Through interactions with his students, Professor Lyles hears about the personal challenges they often face as they attempt to share their views on this subject with others.
I listen to students, they're talking about having to educate their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles. and that can be really hard and stressful, and it can damage relationships. I mean, unfortunately, we're at a point right now where so much of our civic discourse is avoided because we allow people to think too binary. Are you Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal? These things don't shake out on a clean political spectrum. They are so complicated and interwoven. That's why the process that's happened here in Lawrence is so incredible, is because a lot of times the cheap and easy and efficient way to set policy and planning is to keep it all insider, and that makes it safer because you're less likely to lose control. But here in Lawrence, by bringing in a much broader community, it's, in some ways, these processes build more accountability because people realize the connections, that climate change is not something that's going to happen over there or in the future. It is right here, right now.
That's all for now. Thanks for joining us. You can find us on Facebook, where the conversation continues in a group called Hot Times in the Heartland, and watch more videos by way of our website at prairiehollow.net. Hope to see you there.
This program is made possible with support from Diane Shoemaker, encouraging creative, compassionate, and equitable solutions to the challenges we face. By the R.M. Jory Donor Advised Fund in memory of Carol A. Jory. By Richard Porter and Porter Cattle Company. By the Nature Conservancy in Kansas. And by Footprints in Lawrence.